Hello, everyone. I think we're starting to get some people joining us from the waiting room that we had you in. Odd numbers going up. Great to see you all here today. Thank you so much for coming along. I'll just give it another little second. I think we've got loads of people joining us today, which is really great. All right. So good afternoon, everyone, and a big welcome to the Positive Choices webinar series today. I'm going to start by introducing myself. So I'm Dr. Emma Devine, and I'm the project manager for the Positive Choices initiative. And I'm based at the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use at the University of Sydney. And I just want to say a really big welcome to everyone who's joining us for today's webinar, and a big thanks for being here as well. So how are we doing on numbers? Yeah, so brilliant. So before I go any further, we're all coming together from different parts of the country today. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, water and community. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you are and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us for our webinar today. So before we get into today's presentation, I'm going to quickly go through a couple of housekeeping points so everyone knows what's happening today. So first off, as attendees of this webinar, you are currently on listen only mode. And what this means is that we aren't able to hear you or to see you. We will also be recording this webinar session and it will be made available through the Positive Choices website along with the slide handouts as well. And finally, we'll have a question and answer session towards the end of this webinar. So as the session progresses, if you've got any questions, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A box that should be on your screen somewhere as well. So I wanted to start by giving a really quick introduction to Positive Choices, who we are and what it is that we do before we move on. So Positive Choices was developed by the Matilda Centre in consultation with teachers, students and parents, and it is funded by the Australian Government Department of Health. It's a website that aims to provide evidence-based alcohol and other drug information and education resources that are up to date and importantly that are accurate. Positive Choices houses lots of different resources for teachers, schools and parents, families and students, and includes things like fact sheets, videos, as well as games to engage young people in drug education. The website also provides access to classroom-based drug prevention programs that are proven to reduce drug-related harms. One of the other resources that we have on Positive Choices is the webinar series, so you can access any recordings from past webinars on the website as well. So I do encourage you to have a little visit and have a look at some of the great resources that we've got there. But without further ado, we'll move on to today's webinar, which is on risk-taking and why teens do the things that they do. And we're really excited to have Paul Dillon here with us today from Drug and Alcohol Research and Training Australia. So Paul has been working in the area of drug education for more than 25 years now. And through his own business, Drug and Alcohol Research and Training Australia, or DARTA, he's been contracted by many organisations to give regular updates on current drug trends. Paul continues to work with many school communities across the country to ensure that they have access to good quality information and best practice drug education. In 2009, his best-selling book for parents was published and it's titled Teenagers, Alcohol and Drugs, and has since been released internationally, being translated into a number of different languages. With a broad knowledge of a range of content areas, Paul regularly appears in the media and is regarded as a key social commentator, with interviews on television programs including Sunrise and The Project. Paul also has a blog, a man of many talents here. Paul also has a blog where he discusses topical issues of the day, as well as addressing some of the questions and queries he's regularly asked by those who attend his presentations. So really excited and a big thank you to Paul, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you to Positive Choices for inviting me to be a part of today. Hopefully that screen has come up. Emma, can you just do a thumbs up? I can see it. Thank you so much. So you can see the title of this talk, as Emma has just said, Risk-Taking, Why Do Teens Do the Things They Do? And this is designed, I've written this with parents in mind, because the title says, what can parents do to keep them as safe as possible? I know there may be some educators who are also listening. And I will try to kind of bring that in at the same time through this presentation. Now, I've got a very short time. Hopefully, this will be finished at about 10 to 2, so about 50 minutes max to get through this. Got a lot to get through, so I will begin. I suppose when we talk about teens, there's often this discussion about adolescence or being a teenager. Is it the same? Is it different? And where I suppose going to put the focus on today's presentation. So let's look at adolescence first. It's a term that is a relatively new term, as teenagers are as well, but it's a phase of life stretching through between childhood and so I'm just moving something, between childhood and adulthood. It really is, as you can see there, beginning in biology and ending in culture. So realistically, it starts when the first woman's first period, and then ends with marriage. Now, this has stretched, it has lengthened out over time. So what we've seen is adolescence way back in the mid-19th century would possibly last for about 5 years. It has lengthened and lengthened and lengthened over time as adolescents enter adolescence earlier, young children enter adolescence earlier, and adolescents take longer to actually become adult, take longer to leave home, longer to actually get married. So there has been a move, and certainly it came up in the Lancet a couple of years ago, that a pile of experts came in and said, look, we should really change the definition of adolescence. No longer should it be 10 to 19, which it was, it should now be 10 to 24, getting longer. And the trouble is that means that this very risky time, and I'm going to talk about why it's a risky time, has lengthened. Now, we also have the issue, that's adolescence. What about teenagers? Well, this is even a newer term. It's a very new concept. And as you can see by this, I think this quote is wonderful. The teenager is one of the more unusual inventions of the 20th century. Humans have been turning 13 for tens of thousands of years, but only recently did it occur to anybody that this was something special. In most ancient cultures, they focused on older people, but the modern culture is fully teenocratic, governed by the tastes of young people. And so we have seen a tremendous change here. Now, for this talk, I'm going to be focused on teenagers, which is a period of time. So basically from the age of 13 to the age of 19. I'm going to look at that really school-based young people. Adolescence is a much longer period. It can be used, and the terms are often used interchangeably in research, but realistically, I'm going to look at that age group. I'm going to cover a few things. First off, the history of teenagers. It's really interesting, I think, so I'll do that quite quickly, but the whole issue of teenage rebellion. Why are teens such a risky time? Why do they do the things they do? And why is risk-taking far more likely to occur during this period of their lives? And then I'm going to touch on teenage parties, gatherings, or gabos, as they're often called by young people, and sleepovers, and why they involve risk-taking. And then what can parents do? Some simple kind of tips, strategies to keep teens safer and prevent, or at least minimize the high-risk behavior. So let's look first off at the history of teenagers. The term teenager is very, very new. In fact, there was no reason for this group to even exist as a cultural group for a very long time. There was no culture or institution that united them or fostered peer group development on a societal scale. So we really didn't see them pop up anywhere. That all changed around 1910. And it changed because of three things that popped up at the beginning of the 20th century. And these all occurred in the US, which is the main influence on teenagers. Certainly, first off, it was compulsory education. All of a sudden, young people were brought together. They weren't brought together, certainly from, if they did come together, they came together in a workplace, and it was a very different kind of environment. Rise of compulsory education was one. The second thing that popped up there was the post-war economic boom that actually enabled young people to, I suppose, have a little bit of independence from their parents. And then the final one, and I think this is absolutely fascinating, and the research shows quite clearly this is a significant reason why we saw teenagers emerge, and that was the development, the invention of the car. It gave them independence from their parents and allowed them to interact with their peers away from parental supervision. But even though I suppose teens started around that time, we really didn't see a teenage identity until really the 1940s. In the 1940s, we first saw teenagers develop their own unique identity, where you saw them having the same haircuts, wearing the same clothes, enjoying the same music. And it was the Bobby Soxer movement in the 1940s that really saw the heralding emergence of teenagers. Now, if you look at the research in this area, they basically say there were two events that really cemented that teenage identity. And those two events were, first off, a concert that Frank Sinatra gave at the Paramount Theatre in New York in October of 1944. 25,000 teenagers descended upon Midtown Manhattan and shut the island down. The other thing that happened was the first edition of 17 magazine. This became an opportunity for advertisers and marketers to really kind of capitalize on the emerging teen culture. So those things happened, but where did the actual term teenager come from? Well, we talked about, you saw words like teeners and teensters, but in 1941, the term teenager was actually developed by an advertising agency. And it was done because they saw this market of a group of young people who were coming together that they could make money from. The interesting thing about teenagers over time is that they have always been linked to growing media technology at the time. So way back in the 1940s, it was linked particularly to the development of television in the early days and FM radio. And if you look at media reports way back in the 40s, you can see them talking about the evil of FM radio and how it's going to corrupt our youth. This has continued over time. And of course, now we have young people very much linked to smartphones, the internet, etc. What we saw through the teenage years was this enabled young people to get more leisure time and independence from family. We started seeing for the first time this age group having fun. Previously, they were children and then they went to work. There was not or they had children of their own. There wasn't the opportunity to have fun. They started to in the 40s, and surprise, surprise, youth as fun started to be, I suppose, particularly but manipulated by the media to say youth as trouble. And that's when we started seeing the whole issue, the whole kind of concept of teenage rebellion. And this really kind of blossomed in the 50s, particularly because of mainstream media promoting it. So this was the kind of the era of Rebel Without a Cause, movie, Blackboard Jungle, where we started seeing teens being portrayed as that whole kind of concept, I suppose, of the juvenile delinquent. Now, teens through the years have certainly changed, and often it's linked to fashion. So you could see here, there's the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And we saw the change occurring. And sometimes the fashion could be a sign of the times, or some teens actually used it to make a statement. Now, across really since the 1920s, we started seeing this concept of teenage rebellion continue. And it's often linked to trends and crazes that really caused great concern amongst parents. So as I said, it started in the 20s with the advent of pool halls across the US, where when a pool hall went into a little tiny town, it was seen as the beginning of the end of everything in existence. It was Satan moving into the small town. It is often, and anybody who, I was around in the 70s, but certainly if you're around in the 80s, it was linked to certain music. You could see jazz in the 40s, rock and roll in the 50s, punk in the 70s, the new romantics in the 80s, lots of different things. And it can be linked to things that kind of scare parents, like dance movements, makeup and clothing, and of course, alcohol and other drugs. Because if you look at certain music, often it's linked to certain drugs. So for example, I suppose the advent of the great big dance events, music festivals, have really been linked to drugs like ecstasy and MDMA. But back in jazz in the 1940s, it was certainly cannabis and to some extent even opium heroin. There are also new and evolving issues that kind of get linked to teenagers. There's a whole new range of drugs that this is constantly changing. I work in the drug area on a day-to-day basis. It's very difficult to keep up with new substances that appear and disappear. We have the whole issue of internet and social media that have brought, I suppose, into mainstream and ease of access, things like pornography, gambling, the issue of sexting, and of course, what we are seeing currently, I suppose, over the last couple of years is the whole issue of negotiating or managing consent. So that's kind of like a history of teenagers to kind of say that through all time, since we started seeing this group come together way back, we have seen it associated with that issue of rebellion, the whole idea that parents don't understand what their kids are doing because, as I said, they're often linked to new technology, new trends, new crazes. But why are the teen years such a challenging time? Well, it's really simple. It's got to do with their brain. Now, this is a terrific, very easy to read book that I would strongly suggest if you have any interest in what the research says. It's a really great little kind of overview of the research around the teenage brain. It's written by a neuroscientist who has teenagers of her own, and she talks about how to guide. It's a simple guide to raising adolescents when you understand their brain. I think often we think of a teenage brain and we think that they're not as smart as they should be. In actual fact, as you can see there, the quote, the reasoning abilities are more or less fully developed by the age of 15. If you give them aptitude tests, they score very similar to adults. And the reality is when it comes to anything around risk-taking behaviour, they are usually aware of the dangers. I start speaking to young people in schools in year 10. I talk about alcohol. There's not one of the year 10s that I'm speaking to who is not aware that if you drink too much, there are potentially negative consequences as a result. But does that mean they're not going to do it? So, of course not. So why the risk-taking? Well, it's essentially because the actions of both adults and teens are guided by different parts of the brain. So as an adult, and I'm going to repeat myself a number of times here, but to try to repeat it in a different kind of a way to make it easy and make it very visual. An adult, basically, we make decisions using the prefrontal, the hippocampus, and the promotor cortex. These are fully developed for an adult. And basically, we look at things, we use reasoning, we use judgment, we use life experience. And as a result, we often, when we look at a choice, we are risk averse. And as a result, we don't do it. Basically, as an adult, we're terrified of everything. So we look at a situation, we look at a choice, and we usually are risk averse. Now, teens, on the other hand, they don't have those parts. There's the decision-making part of their brain, the prefrontal cortex right at the front is the final part of their brain to be developed. And so they don't have that capacity to go through a choice. They don't think through situations. They use their emotional part of their brain. It's a gut reaction to things. They jump into situations. So if you want to look at this a different way, here's teens, here's adults. Now, there's a whole range of different things that we link to teenage activity: high-risk driving, sexting, shoplifting, vandalism. Those kind of things are things that we traditionally would see during younger years. Now, why? Well, as I said, as a teen, we use the emotional part of our brain. We don't have the prefrontal cortex at the front to basically put the brake on. When we look at a situation, when adolescents look at a situation, they look at it, they see the reward for it, they actually jump into doing it. Now, for an adult, this part, the prefrontal cortex, as I said, it's kind of like the braking system. When you look at a situation and you have to make a decision, what happens is you look at all of the risks, you look at the rewards, and what happens is you go, the risk is too great. Your foot is put on the brake and you don't do it. So put simply, as I said, I'm going to repeat myself a couple of times here, but it hopefully adds on a little bit every time. The actions of an adolescent are guided by the emotional part. This results in a decrease in reasoned thinking, an increase in impulsiveness. As I said, they jump into things. I often say to young people, can you think of a time in the last 12 months where you did something and then 30 seconds later, you thought, why did I do that? You did it because you don't have that braking system. They're more likely to get involved in fights and arguments, not only with their peers, but with their parents. They find it difficult to pause to consider consequences. Now, that doesn't mean they don't know what the consequences are. I think often, I'll talk about this again later, so often parents, particularly when something goes wrong in a school, will kind of jump at the school and say, we're not providing enough education. The fact of the matter is, most of the time, these kids are full aware of the risks. They're fully aware of the consequences. But you know what? They don't matter in the scheme of the world at that point. I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. They're far less likely to change risky or inappropriate behaviours. Now, this does not mean that they don't know the difference between right and wrong. And it certainly doesn't mean they shouldn't be held responsible for their actions to some degree. They can make good decisions. It's just a little bit more challenging for them, and particularly when they're in certain environments, which I'll highlight in a second. So to try to give you this in a really visual way, I think if you're a parent who's come on here today because you have a young person, you have a child who is pushing all of your buttons constantly, and you're thinking, why are they doing this? I'm a pretty good parent. Why aren't they kind of listening? Well, it's because, and I think this is a phrase that every parent should basically, stamp onto their brain and never remove, teens weigh risk reward differently. As I said, they know what the risks and dangers are for the most part, but they value the reward far more than an adult. What that means is they don't downgrade the risk, they just give more weight to the payoff. So to put this, once again, as I said, in a really visual way, what an adult does is we see, and I love this, I think this is a great little term, we see the downsides of risky behaviour in high definition. When you look at a situation, as I said, we're risk averse. When we get a fully developed adult brain, we're terrified of everything. And so as a result, we don't take part in that activity. We see it in high definition. Unfortunately, for an adolescent, they see the potential rewards as if projected onto an IMAX screen with surround sound. The reward is so big that it completely overshadows the risk. So, as I said, once again, in a very visual sense, say an adult is in a car and the passengers sitting next to them, both adults with fully developed brains, and the passenger says to the adult, we're going to be late for dinner. Put your foot down. At that point, what an adult does, and they do this in a millisecond, a nanosecond, they look at the reward. Now, the reward is really simple. They'll get to dinner on time. But the risks are they could get caught speeding, they could get fined, they could lose points, they could cause an accident, they could damage the car, a whole range of different things. And at that point, because we are an adult and we have that braking system in the prefrontal cortex, the risks just outweigh the reward. And as a result of that, we don't put our foot on the accelerator. Now, teens, just the opposite. What the teens do, say two teens are sitting in a car and one teen says to the other, we're going to be late for the party. Put your foot down. Now, at that point, the teens are well aware, as a P plater, as an L plater, they are aware of the risks. The risks are they could get caught speeding, they could lose their P plates, they could get fined, they could go to court, they could do a whole pile of things. And the reward is they could get to the party on time and gain peer acceptance. And surprise, surprise, the reward completely dominates. And as a result, they're likely to put their foot on the accelerator, even though they know all the risks. Now, the next part of this is incredibly important, and it's one of my, I suppose, big pushes when I speak to parents, the parent nights, when parents, and particularly in the time now, moving into a time where for many parts of the country that have been through a very long period of lockdown or restrictions and moving into an easing of restrictions and the summer season, we're going to see parties, gatherings, gavos, whatever you want to call them, sleepovers occurring. And when you look at this, the brain, how the teen brain works in those environments, absolutely. What happens if they're around their peers, or, and this is incredibly important, or even if they believe their peers are watching them, the reward increases. And what happens is they're going to be more willing to take risks. So as soon as you put them into a situation where they are surrounded by their peers, like a teenage party on a Saturday night, what you're going to see is that that reward is just going to be so great. You can give them all the information you want about why they shouldn't do this or shouldn't do that. But at that point, around their peers, they're more willing to take risk. Now, what many people assume is that this must be about peer pressure. Now, I've got to say, peer pressure is one of my biggest bugbears. I tell the story quite often. We often go on and on about that peer pressure is such a huge influence on young people. What is much greater is social pressure. But I gave a demonstration lesson for the education department many years ago with a group of year sevens, and we were talking about why people take drugs. And somebody asked the question, why do people take drugs? And the entire class, together, in unison, said, peer pressure. And so I said, can anybody tell me what that is? Not one young person knew. This is a term that we often use, and certainly young people use, and that's not necessarily what's happening. Of course, it plays a role, but is it the big role? No, because you might be wondering why you can see a driving simulation game there. Well, it's one of my favourite pieces of research around the teen brain. In a computerized simulation driving game, what they did is they got teens in and they tested them. And what they found was that adolescents performed very similarly to adults. The researchers then went and said to the teens, oh, by the way, do it again, but you've got your two friends are behind that window over there, and they'll be doing it next. Now, they then tested them again. And what they found was, even believing that their peers were watching them, risk-taking increased. Their brains displayed more activation in areas involved in reward valuation. So what this means is that when they are around their peers, of course, peer pressure has an influence. But what is much more important is their brain is changing. Neural pathways change when they believe their peers are present, and they are going to take those risks. Now, young people, parents often say is, well, why does this happen, for heaven's sake? This contradicts basic human behaviour of survival. What is happening is teens their brains are kind of pushing them into high-risk activities. And there is that risk-taking is not just one, there's also sensation-seeking, reward-seeking, all of that stuff. Why is this happening? Well, it's an evolutionary feature, and it's basically to help them, it's to get them to engage in high-risk behaviour, to leave the village and find a mate. It's basically designed to get them out of your house. Now, sadly, this is not happening as much as it used to, because I'm sure some of you will be having your children live with you until they're in their mid to late 20s. Young people are staying at home for longer. Now, this is not just something that you see in adolescent humans. You see it also in rodents, primates, and some birds, and some birds who, at a certain point, seek out same-age peers and fight with their parents. It's all about getting them away from their home territory. It is incredibly important when you look at any of these kind of features of teen years, as I said, sensation-seeking, preference for being with their peers, reward-seeking, or risk-taking, that healthy risk-taking should be encouraged. But what we've seen over recent years is that we are seeing some parents who are increasingly risk-averse. So we are seeing those day-to-day risk-taking activities that young people would traditionally get involved in, like climbing trees, riding your bike through down outside your house, and walking to school, just kind of changing. Parents are much more risk-averse in those areas when we ask why. Certainly, we are seeing things like parental shaming. That whole notion of, if a parent is seen to, let their child climb a tree, all of a sudden you see a whole pile of, quite nasty social media presence there. So you can kind of see why parents are experiencing this. And of course, there's lots and lots of messages about keeping the kids safe. So what's the line for parents? Where should parents, I suppose, be conscious of the risks? And where's a high-risk behaviour likely to occur? Well, to be quite honest, in my experience, particularly around alcohol and drugs, it's these: teenage parties, gatherings, and sleepovers. These events provide a perfect storm. You've got teens that are surrounded by their peers, and very important, these are events, particularly the larger events, that for much of the East Coast have disappeared over the past 18 months, but these are difficult to monitor. We're not talking about little parties of 4 or 5 people. They're relatively simple if parents put their mind to it. But we're talking about those big events, 20, 30, 40 plus 1. Some events 150. You find 18th birthdays where you have the entire year group that get invited. There's a whole range of high-risk behaviours that can occur at these events: alcohol and drug use, sexual activity, driving, and of course violence and fighting. But I'm going to focus on one here. One of these, and I suppose it's the easiest one, and I say that because it's also the most complex in others, but keeping teens as safe as possible, that alcohol. So I'll look at that in terms of teen brains and parental behaviour. For some reason, alcohol sets a particular challenge for parents. When you look at most high-risk activity, parents have, they don't find them acceptable. There are very few parents who would say to their child, you can have a little bit of sex tonight. You can do a little bit of driving tonight. No, we don't see that. But we do see parents with alcohol have a completely different attitude. They're very hesitant about setting limits here. And there's lots of questions about why that happens. Could it be that they drank in their teens and they think that nothing went wrong for them? It's also often, I think it's a cultural thing too in Australia, that it's just seen as a rite of passage. The trouble is that what we know is that parents who are less restrictive in this area, we will see increases in child's first drink, the age they first drank alcohol, their alcohol use frequency, and a whole range of other problems. So it is important that parents do have some boundaries here. And, I think some parents go, well, I can't actually tell them not to drink or try to prevent them drinking. I drink myself. Well, once again, we come back to the sex thing. Most adults are involved in some kind of sexual activity. As I said, we wouldn't turn to your child and say, you can have a little bit of sex tonight, just like you wouldn't, but we are very willing to say you can have a little bit of alcohol. There is a line in the sand, and if you want to actually put it there. So what about parental provision of alcohol? Does that keep them safer? Is this a way of reducing the risks? And there's quite a lot of research in this area that we have, and this is most probably the gold standard. It's a great piece of research that was conducted by UNSW. This was released in 2018. Basically, they got 1,900 others. They were tracking them over time. They're continuing to track this group still. But in 2018, they got them at the age of 17. So they'd seen them at 12, got them all the way through to 17. What they wanted to look at was parental supply of alcohol protectives. So they looked at those young people who were given no alcohol, young people who were given alcohol in a range of different kind of ways. Was it protective? Did this reduce the risk? Well, what they found was there was no evidence that parental supply protects from adverse drinking outcomes. In fact, they found that parental provision of alcohol is associated with subsequent binge drinking. They drank more, alcohol-related harms, and symptoms of alcohol use disorder. So at 17, some of these young people were demonstrating things like alcohol withdrawal. The two kind of, I think, takeaway messages for parents here is, number one, there was no evidence of any benefit or protective effect. So that idea of providing alcohol to keep your child, to reduce the risks, just were not backed up. And very, very importantly, parental supply is associated with increased risk of other supplies. So if you gave them 2 bottles of alcohol to take to a party, they're highly likely to go and drink 2 more. I think this is common sense in many ways. And that is, is it about young people manipulating their parents and, saying, oh, I won't drink? They're teens. And what happens is when they go to a party, do you really believe if they drink those 2 drinks quickly, they're going to sit in a corner and play Scrabble? Of course not. They're around their peers, their brain, the reward is just so huge. Are they likely to drink more? Absolutely, if they can find it. And then we have this study. As I was saying to Positive Choices when I was in the lead up to this, I had no idea about this study. It is quite remarkable. It's called the longitude, growing up in Australia, the longitudinal study of Australian children. 10,000 young people, children, were recruited 0 to 1 in 2004, and they're basically tracking them over time. And about 5 weeks ago, this piece of research came out. It's a fantastic piece of research looking at this representative sample, how many parents were willing to permit young people to consume alcohol in their home. Now, what they found was that 28% of 16, 17-year-olds had permission to drink alcohol at home, 18% had permission to take it to parties, and 14 could do both, 14%. Now, if you flip this, what this means is that 82% of 16 to 17-year-olds did not have permission to take alcohol to parties. So if you're one of those parents who is fighting constantly with your child and your child says, oh, you're the only one who does that, in actual fact, you're not. You're in the majority if you don't actually provide alcohol. But we're talking about risks here, reducing risks. Teens allowed to drink at home were more likely to report having ever drunk alcohol. So allowing your child to drink alcohol is not reducing the amount they drink, and saying no does actually delay their drinking. In terms of how much they drank, for those who consumed, or those who were allowed to drink alcohol at home, they consumed less in the past week, and they consumed less in the past month. And then I think sort of like the icing on the cake here is around harms. For those teens who drank in the past week, those who were allowed to drink at home consumed more. So you were not reducing the amount they're drinking. And then this piece of research looked specifically at a range of harms. And they found that teens who are allowed to drink at home were more likely to have experienced alcohol-related harm. So every parent has to make their own decisions on what they do about alcohol. It's not my job to tell anybody what to do. But if you are doing it because you believe it is protective, the evidence says quite clearly that is not the case. So this is about reducing risk. So what can you do about, for a teen brain, how can you keep them a little bit safer? Well, you can't inoculate your teen. It would be wonderful if you could, but you can't. You can in terms of alcohol, but you can, and very importantly, ensure that they have healthy attitudes and they are as safe as possible. So how do you do that? Well, these three things I'm just going to touch on very quickly and then talk about the three next ones. I think very importantly, you need to create age-appropriate rules and consequences that match your family and match your child. And very importantly, you'll find the rules will go for one child, may not work for the next. That's a really important thing. It might not seem fair, but young people are different. You've got to kind of work out what's going to work. Decide on an outward. This is so important to actually, at a very early age, give them an opportunity, give them a word that if they want to get out of a situation ever and say face, they use a word. It's really good to use a name or an auntie, Vivian, a name, you give a name that they can actually use, and that means they want out. And promote positive norms. Make sure they don't get stuck on this whole idea that everyone gets drunk and everyone drinks alcohol. It's really important. Look, I don't drink alcohol. And when I say that to young people, they are just blown away that anyone does not drink. If you've got anyone in your family who does not drink, wheel them out occasionally and say, look at this strange person. Promote positive norms. But the three I want to look at in a little bit more detail very quickly are, first off, age-appropriate monitoring, be a positive role model, and very important to end this talk, communicate and connect. The first one is a really important one, and I cannot stress this enough. For what we are about to enter, which I believe is one of the most dangerous times for parents and their teens. And that is the movement. And I know there will be some of you from WA, South Australia, and Queensland who have not had, and Tasmania who have not had the restrictions that we've seen particularly in New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT recently. But it doesn't matter. We're about to go into a high-risk time. Summer season restrictions and easing, and age-appropriate monitoring is vital. This is not about helicopter parenting. It's not about standing over your kid and watching them every minute of the day. They have to be allowed to make mistakes, and certainly that's how they learn to be effective adults. But, and I emphasize this very, very strongly, they need rules and boundaries. They might not like them very much, but these are what keep kids safe. Now, these must change and they must adapt over time. You can't keep the same rules and boundaries that you create for a 14-year-old until they are 17. You've got to adapt. And I always say, I would recommend, particularly around that age of 15, 16, every 3 or 4 months, bring your kids and say, look, you've done so well. Let's reward good behaviour. Some of the things that we know are effective of keeping our kids safer during this time: know where they're going and who they're going to be with, take them to where they're supposedly going, and I emphasize supposedly going, and pick them up. Meet, or at the very least, talk to host parents of events your child is attending. Have the name and contact number of at least one of their friends that they will be with when they go out. I did a parent night long ago. I call this the buddy system, where a kid gives you the name, your child gives you a name and a phone number of the person they will be with for the night, just in case something goes wrong. And I had a parent who said, look, I heard your talk years ago. My son was in year 9 then. The buddy system worked really well. He's in year 12 and it doesn't work that well at year 12. And what this mum had arranged, which I think is incredible, she said, look, just write the name and a phone number of someone, put it into an envelope. I promise I will never look at it unless I have to. What that does, and as she said, it's terrific. The son does it every weekend when he goes out. She never needs to look at it. So it's a trust thing, which I think is really important. Agree on a curfew. Many parents don't like the concept of a curfew, but for those of you who do, agree on a curfew. Ask questions about alcohol and adult supervision to parents hosting parties your child is invited to. I would stress, particularly in this summer season coming, you need to know where they're going, who they're with, and what's going to be happening when they get there. This is one that parents don't like very much because they see it as a breaking of trust. But when it comes to illicit drugs particularly, there's quite a bit of evidence to say monitoring their money is a very effective way of reducing access. Knowing where their money's going is incredibly important. And very importantly, ensure you do your homework around sleepovers. Do you know the parents? Will they be home? The whole concept of mixed sleepovers have become very big in the last couple of years. Will there be supervision? Those kind of things, age-appropriate monitoring is important. As they get older, moderate. I said about positive role modelling, I think it's really important that you never underestimate your influence. There's a number of things you can do here, and never think that you don't have an influence with your child, because the evidence shows categorically you do. It just changes. When you are a parent of a child, you have a managing role. As they move into their teen years, it moves into a consulting role. You will always be an influence. And this is a way of being a positive role model. Link alcohol with food whenever you can. Limit your alcohol intake when you are around your child. It doesn't mean about stopping drinking or hiding alcohol. Your child learns about responsible drinking as well from watching you. And of course, during the lockdowns and restrictions that we've had, what has your child picked up about alcohol? Decline the offer of alcohol occasionally, and try, and I love this one, organise alcohol-free events. I'm sure some of you saw a couple of years ago, there was a very famous case in Queensland of a Gold Coast couple who organised an alcohol-free wedding. No one came. Those kind of things you have to be careful with them, but certainly if you can, really great for your kids to see that adults can socialise without alcohol. And I think this last one is a really difficult one, particularly with everything that's happened over the last 18 months with COVID. Don't portray alcohol as a way to deal with stress. You know, if every time you kind of like flop into your chair and go, I need a drink, you're teaching your child that alcohol is a good way to self-medicate. And one of the great concerns about what we may see after the whole COVID thing ends and everything gets back to some degree of normalcy is, will we see some young people self-medicate with alcohol and other drugs as a result of everything that's happened? The final thing I want to talk about, I said there were 3, is the communicate and connect. It's really important to remember it's not just what you say to young people, it's when you say it, where and why. So what I try to do with young people when I talk to them is find out what information they actually want. So often we give them information we think they need instead of saying, what do you want? And when you change when you change the dialogue to ask it, and what kids want is knowing how to look after their friends, knowing what to do if something goes wrong. I see my job when I go into a school of not stopping kids from doing anything, but putting pillows around them so that if something goes wrong, they are safer. And that's about the best we can do during the teen years. We can hammer them with the long-term and short-term effects of a range of different substances, or the risks around driving, or the risks around sexting, or anything. But if they don't have pillows around them, The reality is some of them are going to take part in this activity. We know that a formal sit-down conversation with a child is regarded as heavy-handed and is not effective. And of course, it's always going to be better to be proactive than reacting to a situation. So finding those opportunities to communicate. Certainly what teens want, what we want teens to do is to plan ahead. We know the most unsafe thing they can do is jump into situations. So getting them to do things like, simple things like making sure you discuss 000 and say to them, if something goes wrong, they need to know they have your 100% support, that if something goes wrong, they can call 000 and you will support them in that decision. This app, which I don't have time to talk about today, but if you have not seen it, anyone's ever heard me speak before knows that I do, Emergency Plus. Put this on their phone. It actually tells them when they push it, gives them where they are, and they have that, now this wonderful feature called What 3 Words. You don't have to, when you call an emergency operator, you don't have to say where you are. You just read 3 words at the bottom, which are at the bottom of the app, which will tell the operator exactly where you are to your GPS coordinates. I've also talked about providing a name and number of their buddy for the night, but really it's simple information. If your child is going to go off to a party on a Saturday night, they're 15 years old. If they do not know, if you have not given them information about how to look after a drunk friend, how to look after someone who's vomiting, those kind of things, simple little bits of information, which they are desperate for. And that provides those pillows. The final 2 slides really are about keeping connected. This is a fantastic book. If any of you are having problems with your child at the moment, we are butting heads constantly. They're not communicating. They're not speaking to you. They're just kind of mumbling at you. This is a great book, and I bought my new one on Amazon US. It costs $11, and I've given so many of these away to different parents over the years. It's a terrific book that gives you very practical strategies on how to maintain communication. We know that the teen years, because of their brain, because of the huge reward they get from risky activity, if you can keep talking to them, it is very, very powerful. And they give you lots of strategies there that you can access. And the final thing I'll say is, and I finish, anybody who's ever heard me speak at a parent night, I always finish with these 3 things. First off, tell your children they're great all the time. Our kids have been through a really tough time, whether you live in the COVID bubble of WA or whether you live right in the heart of the Melbourne situation. Our kids have been through a very strange 2 years. They need to be told how wonderful they are. It blows my mind when I give a talk, a remote learning talk, where I'm kind of beamed into these kids' bedrooms, talking to them, and their faces come up. And the kids in Melbourne who've been through a really tough time, they're still smiling. We need to tell them how great they are. Listen to your child and connect, as I've already said. And finally, 3 simple golden rules. And I've talked about these already, but if your child is going anywhere and you want to reduce the risk, you want to, being aware that they weigh risk reward differently, know where your child is, know who they're with, and know when they'll be home. I'm on social media. If anybody has a specific question that I don't address in the next 12 minutes, you can email me. I'm on Facebook and Twitter. So if all my blogs, all my resources that I think are useful to parents, I put up on my, my social media. I'm also on Instagram, and I now have, and I'm very proud of it, 32,500 followers on Instagram. And all I do on a Saturday night is I put up a little post at 8 o'clock. And it's one of the messages I give to kids when I see them in schools. And those messages hopefully will keep them a bit safer. What has happened, and I didn't design it this way, a whole pile of parents now follow me on Instagram. And what they do is on a Saturday night, when they get the post, they just say to their kids, oh, what did Paul say tonight? And it starts a conversation. And that is hopefully going to keep them a bit safer. And finally, I have just completed, they have now up, they've been up for about 3 weeks now, a series of 10 podcasts where I'm answering young people's questions about drugs, the questions that they've asked. And as it says, they're providing teens with what they want to know about alcohol and other drugs. And they're designed for young people, but certainly as a parent or an educator, you can access them as well. And I think that's it. I don't know whether I meant to stop sharing. Can you tell me, Emma, should I stop sharing?
Hello, Paul. Oh, good. I can override you to just get the Q&A box up just to prompts and discussion. So, I mean, first off, Paul, thank you so much. I think that was a really, really great session. And I know some of the comments coming through the chat are definitely agreeing with that sentiment, that it was really informative. And as you said yourself, it's a really great time for this sort of information to be made even more available, with sort of lifting restrictions and summer coming up. We've got a couple of minutes left before we have to wrap up to take any questions that anyone might have. So please, hop onto the Q&A box and throw your questions into there, and I will start asking Paul some of the ones that we've gotten through already. Okay, so Paul, first question for you. We got a question sort of about halfway through. So I think when you were talking about particularly that sort of peer pressure and social influence type messaging, and the question was, can the reward of the risk that they're taking be escaping stress by being immersed in another state? Is there sort of research that, or anything about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, the reward is influenced by so many things. I think the great problem with the issue of peer pressure and social pressure is that many parents love the concept of peer pressure because they think it's someone else influencing their kids. And so it kind of removes responsibility. The fact of the matter is that when young people are in certain situations, for example, something like, they're involved in nightlife and everyone around them is taking ecstasy and having a really good time, they're going to actually be seeing that. And so you can put all the boundaries around about why they shouldn't be involved in that activity, but their actual experience, their real life experience of watching people around them is showing them that it's actually a really, fun experience, in inverted commas. So, the reward is just too great. And that's why I think that was what the question was talking about. It's much more, it's not just peers putting pressure on them. The social pressure, particularly around, you just have to watch movies and TV, and their representation of drug use is quite often very, very positive.
Yeah, so it's more the risk is just stronger, the reward is just stronger there. And
you've got to remember they're surrounded by their peers who are, they're, and it's not that their peers are turning around and saying, take it. It's really interesting with a drug like ecstasy. There's some fascinating research that shows that in actual fact, peers, if someone said, I want to take ecstasy, and they know their friends do, often their peers will turn around and say, are you sure? It's a big move. It's kind of the reverse. But it's an interesting phenomenon, this, I suppose, that this reward being so good in the changing neural pathways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good way to think about it, I guess, as well as you were describing. We have some questions from parents who are, I guess, looking for some specific strategies you think might be useful in context. So Joanna writes that her son has blocked her ability to see his bank account, and was wondering if you had any strategies for appropriately monitoring that, or vaping and lying about it at the same time as another one. How to monitor that when it's sort of really difficult to know what's going on. So if you had any specific strategies, maybe, or advice there.
I think if you've got to the point where they are blocking you, when they are lying to you about certain activity, I always say to parents, the most important thing there is to do a reboot. If you've really got to a point where the relationship is damaged, you know that they're getting involved in high risk activity, like how to stop sneaking out at night. There's that kind of thing that we're seeing. I think what you do is you find a time. First off, you've got to take a couple of minutes to take a breather and say, okay, I've got to forget everything else. We need a reboot of this relationship. Find a time. It said very, very clearly, it's not just the what you say, but when, how, and why you say it. So the when, find a time. Say, we're not going to go through everything that's happened in the past. We want to start the relationship again. Some young people are going to take the risk, and nothing you can do is going to prevent it. What you can do is you can do a reboot, start the relationship again, and say, we need a new start area, a new starting point here. To try to go back and say, let's change, let me look at your bank account. That's most probably not going to happen. But you can say, I want you to be safe. So can we actually negotiate something so it makes me feel that you are safer? But it is all about starting afresh. If you do that, it's better for them, it's better for you, and you start with a clean slate.
Yeah, absolutely. So back to basics.
And I always say to parents, a really good thing is kids are very visual. So if you actually, I think it's often to get a piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, get your child and say, okay, this is what I want. And for parents, the only thing they want is safety. I want you to come home safe. And then they write over there, here's a texter, write down all the things you want. And what kids will do, they'll say a whole range of things like, I want to go out on Saturday and not come home until Thursday, and a whole range of different things. And then you say, look, I only want one thing. You want all of those. Can we meet in the middle somewhere? Can I give you a couple of those? And then it's, once again, begins that relationship, begins that communication and connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of, I guess, a similar but a bit different. Another of our attendees is asking about an incident that they had recently where there was a potential, drink drugging or sexual assault, potential stabbing event at what they considered normally quite a safe pub. And we're asking, what sort of advice or would you give those kids now who might still be going on to attend that pub in the future?
Wow. I mean, you're talking about, that's a complex thing. Number one, they're obviously of age, so they are legal. So it's very difficult to restrict. I think it's more about, once again, doing kind of a refresh about that venue and saying, okay, what do you find attractive about it? These are my concerns. And let's actually say, well, this is what I'm worried about. Can you tell me? I give you a great example. Often parents talk about their real fears about schoolies. And I'll say, I'm really frightened about my child going to schoolies. What can I do? And I say to them, I am worried because tell me why I shouldn't be. And it's a really great little thing for the young person to actually, it then gets taken on. If you're worried about a particular venue, to say to your child, I'm worried about this venue, tell me why I shouldn't be. And then you may find that they've actually put things into place to keep themselves a little bit safer. And once again, that's about rebuilding your relationship or resetting your relationship.
Yeah. No, I think that's some really good advice.
I think we never give credit. Sorry.
Go on, Paul.
No, I just don't think we give enough credit to young people often that they do consider the harms. Remember, they do know the dangers. Now, when they're in the situation, of course, the reward is much bigger. But quite often, and I am gobsmacked sometimes how young people come up. I often ask parents, if you're going to create rules and boundaries, and also ask kids what the consequences should be if they break them. And you know what? Kids come up with much worse consequences than parents would ever even consider. So often they can come up with strategies to keep themselves safer.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a really interesting question here about how, parents can support or educate young people, or about how they can empower their friends to not continue with the risky behaviours, so like vaping or smoking. Is there any sort of empowerment that these young people could be supported in?
Yeah, look, I think it's really tough. There's some really interesting research coming from America at the moment about vaping and seeing why there appears to be a decline in vaping. And it appears to be that young people have watched their friends vape, get into trouble with it, becoming nicotine dependent, and that's deterring use. So I think certainly young people can influence their friends. It's very, very tough, I think, as a teenager to turn around and try to say, don't drink or don't do this. I get, oh, goodness me, it would be really regularly, at least once every couple of weeks, when I'm speaking to kids, a young person will come up, and it's not the goody kids. It's often the high-risk kids who will come up and say, we're really worried about a friend of ours. She appears to be drinking every weekend and she's getting smashed and blah, 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 blah. And they say, what can we do? So young people are looking for an option. And as I always say, the best thing to do is say you're concerned, and, the basic stuff that we often would tell a parent to do as well. You can't change people's behaviour. You'd have to lock them in a room and, not allow them to do it. And that's very difficult. But what you can say is, I have concerns. Tell me why I shouldn't be concerned. That's a really great way of putting the onus back on the person rather than saying you're doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, and could really sort of change the approach they take and the thinking to it. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that sounds really great.
I think the swap
we are
over of
sorting.
you're doing something bad is much. I am concerned about what's happening. Can you? I think the phrase that I always say to young people: "Can you tell me why I shouldn't be?" And yeah, it's a powerful phrase.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've just seen we have reached the 2 o'clock mark on the webinar today. I would just like to apologise to anyone whose questions we didn't get to. We obviously had loads of people joining today and more questions than we could get through in the time. But please do feel free to email Paul, as he was saying, but also to email through any questions you may have to us at Positive Choices. But also if today or anything that was discussed today has been distressing or anything, has brought anything up for you, please do see the information helplines and websites that are available on your screen at the minute as well. But I would like to wrap up by saying a huge thank you to Paul. It has been really wonderful having you, really informative, as again I was saying, all the chat talk is supporting that. And to anyone, we will have this recording and slides available on the Positive Choice website, and you will be emailed a copy as well. So just to sort of wrap up and say thank you very much. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.